Hello, Swift students. I'm Professor John Gallagher, and thank you so much for letting me be part of your journey to learn to program using Swift and SwiftUI for iOS development. In this lesson, we'll get a solid introduction to Xcode, and we'll write our first SwiftUI code. And by the end, we'll have this simple screen, but we'll begin to lay the foundation for more learning. It's longer than most of my lessons, but if you're a newbie, trust me, it'll be worth it. Now, at this point, you should have Xcode installed on your Mac and configured with a free Apple developer account. If not, there's a lesson in the playlist that'll show you what to do. So launch Xcode. This is the version of Xcode I used to record this lesson. If you're using a version of Xcode that's a version or more higher than this, check the playlist for a lesson on any differences. Now on the welcome screen, select Create a New Xcode Project. I'll make Xcode full screen by clicking on the green traffic light in the upper left-hand corner. And now in this window, you see along the top we have options for building apps that are for macOS, watchOS, tvOS, Vision Pro. Apple even has options to create apps across different platforms, but in the current tutorials, we're going to be focusing on iOS apps that work on the iPhone and iPad, so click iOS. Then under Application, we see the icon for App should be selected, and then click the Next button. Now here we're being asked to name our product, and I think it's awesome that you're learning to code, so let's name our first app You Are Awesome. Now when you name projects, it's a good idea to eliminate any spaces. I'll cover why in a later video, and you'll see that I've capitalized the first letters of the U, R, and Awesome. Now you'll also see a team name down here. It'll probably say Personal Team on it if you have a free Apple developer account, so be sure to select that. The organization identifier should be com.yourlastname. Later we'll learn that Apple uses this to uniquely identify apps that you build. Under Interface, make sure that SwiftUI is selected. You'll also see Storyboard in there. That's from Apple's older technology called UIKit. I taught a course in UIKit for years. Right now I'm focusing on the newer and more modern SwiftUI. The language should say Swift. And you can also set the testing system and the storage both to none. We won't be using either of those in our first app. Then click Next and you'll select a location where you want to save your work. But before you do that, in this source control area down here, make sure the check mark is clicked next to Create Git Repository for my Mac. In a future lesson, we'll learn to use Git and GitHub for version control and to save versions of our source code to the cloud. Now I'm going to save my project to the desktop. Now also click on the Create button, and what we've just done is created a folder on the desktop that includes the initial files we're going to be using to start building our app. Now before we hop into our tour of Xcode, I actually want to quit Xcode because there are some important things to know about the project we've just created. Now I've saved my project on the desktop, so I see a folder named You Are Awesome, and if I click inside this folder, I see another folder named You Are Awesome. Plus I see a file that ends in .xcodeproj. Now this xcodeproj file is the file that you open if you ever quit Xcode and you want to get back into a project to continue your work. Now in the first few apps that we build, the xcodeproj file should be the only file that we open. Maybe you have your Finder in column format instead of list format, but you see the same thing, a You Are Awesome folder that's got another You Are Awesome folder in it, as well as youareawesome.xcodeproj. Now, a very big and important warning. Do not rename any of these files. And also, do not move the folder or any of the files inside while Xcode is open. It's unfortunate that Xcode projects are so fragile, but I've seen a lot of students run into problems thinking that they could simply rename a project by changing the file name. You can't do that with Xcode. I've also seen students create problems by moving folders and projects around while Xcode was still open. That can screw things up for you too. So do not rename files, do not move folders while Xcode is open. Now, one thing you can do, and which can be very useful while learning, is to make a copy of your current project. Maybe you want to experiment with techniques and make changes to the work that you've just done, but you don't want to impact the original work. Well, if you've quit Xcode, you can select your outermost project folder, not the inner one, and duplicate it. Command D is the Finder keyboard shortcut for duplicate, and now I have two projects on my desktop. This second one is a distinctly different project. Even if I click open the folder, I can see that the files inside both of these have the same names. It's the outer folder that matters. If I were to click on this xcodeproj here, I'd be working on the copy, not the original. But for now, I don't need this duplicate project, so I'm just going to throw it in the trash. Now back in my original project folder, you should never need to get into this second internal project folder. We can access everything we need directly from Xcode, but just to show you, if I click the expansion triangle on the You Are Awesome folder that's inside the outermost You Are Awesome folder, I see a bunch of names for files and folders that will be identical to items that we'll see in Xcode. There's an assets folder, a content view file, a preview content folder, and the You Are Awesome app.swift file. Now I can collapse this folder, get back into Xcode by clicking You Are Awesome xcodeproj. My You Are Awesome project loads in Xcode, and this column on the leftmost side, I see those same things that I just saw in the folder. The assets folder, content view,
preview content folder, and the You Are Awesome app file.
The vertical column on the left is known as the navigator pane. Now, when this first icon, the one that looks like a little folder, is highlighted, then you're in what's called the project navigator in the navigator pane. The project navigator shows the files and folders that are associated with your current project. These icons here have show hide triangles to the left, so if files aren't showing, you can click the triangle, it'll point downward, and it should expose any of the files that are inside of a folder or component. Now we see two files that are in here.
One has our project name,
You Are Awesome, followed by the word app, so let's click that one. Now most of this likely looks very unfamiliar, but no big deal, we're going to ignore it. But one bit of interest that we see in this very first file, in the center it says Content View. This is the place that Xcode sets up by default for us to begin coding the first screen in our SwiftUI project. This first file in our app will load and run another file in our app named Content View. That's the name Xcode gives this file by default.
find Content View in the project navigator and click it.
Now we're going to start changing the code here in just a moment, but also know that you don't always need to have the navigator's pane showing. And if you want to give yourself more room on screen, you can use this icon that's just to the right of the three traffic lights. By the way, as I hover my cursor over any of the icons that are in Xcode, you should notice that a tooltip shows up. This one says hide or show navigator, so it tells me what this icon does. And when I click this, I can see that it toggles the left column open or closed.
There's a keyboard shortcut for this. Holding down the Command key while typing the number 0 will toggle the navigator pane open or closed.
Now if we go all the way to the right, we see an icon that looks like a flipped version of the Hide Show Navigators icon that we used over here on the left. Now hover our cursor over this icon on the right, and the tooltip says Hide Show the Inspectors. Now also notice there's a horizontal row of icons just below this Show Hide Inspectors icon. If you click on any of these, it will show a different inspector. We're going to work initially with this one called the Attributes Inspector. The Attributes Inspector is this one that looks like 3 lines that each have little slider circles in them. Now we're going to deal with that in just a bit, but for now, let's just click the button to hide the inspectors. We've maximized our screen real estate.
There's also a keyboard shortcut to show or hide the inspectors. That's Option Command 0. So it's Command 0 to toggle the inspectors pane on the left, Option Command 0 to toggle the inspectors pane on the right.
Now to the right, we see the preview pane. It probably says preview paused.
Now before clicking the circular arrow to refresh,
let's select the kind of device that we want to simulate in the preview. Now you can do this by clicking right in the center of the toolbar, just to the right of where it says You Are Awesome.
Mine says iPhone 16 Pro.
Yours might list a different device or even say My Mac or any iOS device, but when you click on this item, you should see a menu listing a selection of devices that you can simulate. If you want your screen to look exactly like mine, you can select iPhone 13 Pro or similarly sized device.
There's also a button in the preview pane where you can select the version of the iPhone that you want to preview. It probably says automatic by default with whatever the current flagship version of the iPhone is.
And now I'm going to resume the preview by clicking on this circular arrow button. The first time you do this, it'll probably take a few seconds before you see anything. You'll see an activity indicator whirl. There are some messages that show up in the toolbar as well, but we'll eventually see the device in the preview on the right. Nice! Now my iPhone preview is a bit big, but you can pinch and zoom on your trackpad to resize the preview. You can also zoom with the minus and plus buttons in the lower right. I'm going to click the second button from the right, which is zoom to fit. And since I don't need all of this extra preview room, I can also click and drag the separator line that separates my code from the preview canvas so that I give myself some more coding space. Now, the first time you use Xcode, you might see some other things that take up space. For example, you might have a column like this in the center. This is called the minimap. It's a shrunken representation of the code you're currently viewing. Now, the minimap can be useful if you have a very long code file and you want to see where you are when you scroll through your code. But for now, let's just get rid of the minimap because it's taking up space and we don't need it. So to do that, we can simply select the middle icon of the 3 icons that you see over here in the far right in the upper right-hand corner. These are below the main toolbar Show Hide Inspectors icon. If you hover your cursor over this middle icon, it'll say Adjust Editor Options. Click that, it should open up a menu, and just make sure that minimap is not selected. If it is, deselect it.
And let's make sure your Xcode has 2 handy settings to show line numbers and enable code folding. So head to the Xcode menu and select Settings, then click Text Editing in the toolbar. Make sure line number is selected, and also select the option below this that says Code Folding Ribbon. And you can close this when you're done. You'll see line numbers on the left side of the text editor, and I'll show you code folding in a bit. Now, when you're learning, it's actually okay to ignore things that we don't need to worry about. And right now, we don't need to worry about these first few lines in our code. So we can ignore this struct content view and var body. Those are going to show up automatically every time we create a file that displays things in our app. We'll learn about that later. We'll ignore it for now. In fact, let's separate it from the code that we want to pay attention to. So let's click behind the curly brace that's in this body line. Then I'll press return. That gives us an extra line space. And let's do the same in this padding line down here, just after the closing parenthesis. So we're going to focus on this middle stuff in here. Let's learn what it does. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see our preview area, and the iPhone has the image of a globe, and the text says hello world. And if we look at the code on the left, we see stuff that's likely not familiar, but we do see the word image with parentheses. Inside it says system name, colon, and the word globe surrounded by double quotes. And below that is the word text, and it's got the phrase hello world surrounded by parentheses and double quotes. And if you thought the image line creates the image of the globe, and the text line creates the text hello world, you guessed right, coder. Now, everything we see in an app is what we call a view in SwiftUI. So image is one type of view, text is another, but what's this thing that says VStack? Well, that's a SwiftUI statement that says stack everything inside of these curly braces vertically. So here's your first challenge, Smarty. If this statement says stack things vertically, can you figure out how you'd stack things side by side or horizontally? Why don't you quickly pause this lesson and try it out on your own? And remember, you can always undo with Command Z if you make a mistake. And if you guessed it, stack things horizontally, you just replace VStack with HStack. You're right. If you got that right, give yourself a boom shakalaka. You're thinking like a coder. Cool. Now I'm going to go back to VStack since that's what we want for this first app. And another thing, the contents of the VStack are enclosed in these curly braces. Each open curly has a matching closing curly. Sometimes programmers have a hard time matching the curly braces, but if you hold down the Option key and move your cursor over one, you'll see the other is highlighted. See how I'm doing that right here on screen? Also, after I click behind one curly brace, its opposite pair is briefly highlighted in yellow. See that? It applies to either the open or the closed curly brace. By the way, this also applies to things like parentheses and square brackets. And there's one more super cool thing we can do. Remember we added that code folding ribbon? If I move my cursor over to the area just to the right of my line numbers on the left-hand side of my code here, I can see this down and up pointing arrow shows the start and end of my VStack. And if I click in here, ho-ho, see that? The code is folded. That's code folding. For me, I see my lines go from 13 to 19. The other lines are in there. If I click the ribbon again where I have this arrow pointing right, the code is unfolded. Cool. Also, another thing to point out is that sometimes students accidentally click on a line number. It creates this blue breakpoint. We'll learn what those do later, but if you do this by accident, know that you can just click and drag the breakpoint out of this area on the left. This area, by the way, is called the gutter, and if you release it into your code, it disappears. Cool. Now let's modify our code.
Now let's first look at this code that says text. Now when we write text in SwiftUI, that's capital T and followed by parentheses, SwiftUI will write text on screen based on whatever we pass through those parentheses. Now here we pass in the text between double quotes, and in computing, a series of characters like this is called a string. So remember, whenever you hear the word string in computing, it refers to a string of characters. In Swift, we specify a string by surrounding the text in double quotes, and those are straight quotes, not curly quotes. Now, hello world is painfully basic. I think it's awesome that you're learning to build apps, so let's change this so that it reads, "You are awesome!" exclamation mark in between the double quotes, and look over to the right. The text has changed. Now, new coders, your first warning. Programming languages demand precision, and if I, by accident, delete the double quotation mark at the end, Xcode will eventually highlight this as an error.
Be sure to follow along with me. You should commit this error too, and we'll learn together how to fix it. Now, this little red circle of anger is an error indicator. It tells you that there's an error on this line. If you click it, you might get more information. Unfortunately, many times the errors aren't really new coder friendly. So you see this line down here has a fix button. If I were to click it, it actually wouldn't fix my problem. It would create a new problem. Now I suspect as there's more AI baked into Xcode, the fixes will get more accurate. But down here, this says unterminated string literal. We do know what a string is, and unterminated means it doesn't have an end, so that's actually correct. We have an open but not a closing double quote. And by the way, when we get an error in our code, there are a few more things to note. Xcode put a little underline under the opening double quote as if to say, hey, I think you should start looking here for the problem. And in the upper right, we also see another error indicator, one of these red dots of anger. If we click that, it says some of what we saw in the error indicator on the line where the error was detected. If you select the error from the drop down here, your cursor will jump to where that error occurred in your code. Also notice in the preview, we get a red dot next to the content view name. That's the name of our current file. And below that, it says that we cannot preview this file because we have an error. So let's fix that. Remember, just Command Z will undo. That gets us back to the point before we made the error. We've got both of our double quotes. All the little red circles of anger are gone, and our code shows up in the preview again. Now let's commit a couple more errors before moving on. If I delete the closing paren here, I get a different error. In fact, this one shows up on the line below where I deleted that paren. It says expected closing paren in the expression. Now if I click on the red circle error indicator here, it says match to the opening paren, and I can click on the show button in here, and what that does is Xcode will place the cursor at the opening paren so that I can scan my code and see where I want to put in the closing paren. Now let's fix this error by adding the paren at the end, and we'll commit one more error. Let's remove the first double quote in front of the string "you are awesome." And we notice a few different errors here, but the thing I want you to notice is that the text "you are awesome" is no longer red. Xcode will pretty print our code. It will change different types of code to different colors, and by default, code that's a string appears as red. We see the word globe up here is a string, it's enclosed in double quotes, and it's all red. Now eventually you'll get good at recognizing pretty print colors, and if the colors appear off, that's likely an indicator that you need to fix something in your code, but we'll go back and we'll add that double quote in front of "you are awesome" again, it turns red, and we're ready to continue.
Now this text is very boring, so let's jazz it up a bit. First, I'm going to show you how we can do this with the Attributes Inspector. Now make sure the cursor is clicked somewhere on the same line where text is, and then to show the attributes for that text, I'm going to click on the Show Inspectors icon in the upper right-hand corner. The Attributes Inspector icon is selected, and this should show you the attributes that we can change for text.
Now sometimes Xcode doesn't initially show the right attributes for the line that you've clicked on. If you're not seeing anything in the Attributes Inspector, try clicking on another line in your code, then back in the text line. That should work. In extreme cases, if Xcode isn't working the way you expect, sometimes it helps to quit Xcode and restart. Xcode is constantly saving everything as you type, so there's no need to save anything before quitting. Now we'll also learn that Xcode provides lots of ways to accomplish the same thing.
So here, we can also pull up the equivalent of the Attributes Inspector on the right by holding down the Control key plus the Option key and clicking on the word for text in our code. Now we can see that this displays a pop-up that looks almost identical to what we see on the right.
The word text in the upper left confirms that these are text view attributes.
So feel free to use either of these options to change the attributes. Now, one of the options in here is font. So let's pull down this menu and see what we got. And these aren't the fonts that you usually access from, say, a word processor. Instead, they're Apple's system font choices. Now, while it is possible to access the other fonts that are available on your Mac, we're going to ignore that for now. Using these fonts has a few advantages, including a guarantee that they'll work well when using accessibility features, like increasing the type size of your iOS device. Now, for the font, since I've got bad eyesight and I very much want to loudly declare your awesomeness, I'm going to select the font Large Title. But before I let go, look at the code over here on the left. Once I select Large Title, hey, Xcode writes some code for me. And I can see in the preview that the text "you are awesome" is now in larger type. Now this dot notation that you see in front of the word font, and there's no space between dot and font, means that font is a modifier. Font is a function or a little chunk of code
that modifies the view above it, in this case the view text.
So in this case, a view, which is text, is being changed by the modifier, named font, which takes the input value, large title, which is the name of the specific font to be used when changing the font of text. Now don't get confused by the dot in front of large title. That doesn't mean that large title is a modifier function. This dot notation is also used to refer to some predefined data, and in this case, dot large title refers to Apple's large title font. More on that later. Now we just use the Attributes Inspector to have Xcode write code for us, but eventually you'll be comfortable enough to just start typing code in yourself. Let me show you how that works, and you should follow along too. First, let's highlight and delete the line Xcode just added for us. Now I'm going to press return. I'm on the new line.
Now, by the way, what I'm seeing here with this grayed out text is Apple's best guess as what I want to enter for my code. This is called predictive code completion. It's part of Apple Intelligence, artificial intelligence. It's trained on Apple's own code base, and it also seems to learn from my own code. So you may or may not be seeing the same grayed out text that I'm showing here. Now don't do this, but just so that you know, if I were to press tab, the grayed out code would be entered for me. Now I don't want to do that. In fact, I recommend that you don't use Apple Intelligence when you're learning Swift and SwiftUI basics. AI is great, it can be super helpful, but it's often wrong. And I'm going to point out when in our lessons, although it's guaranteed to be getting better and better, so you may find that you're getting better recommendations and I'll show you in my lessons. Now you want to make sure that you know basics well enough to be able to tell when AI is wrong, and if you're going to apply for a developer job someday, you also want to make sure that you understand the basics so that you can survive a code interview where you're almost certainly not going to be allowed to refer to AI before you answer. So to get rid of the AI recommendations, I'm going to press the escape key. You'll see me do that from time to time in our lessons. So without the AI recommendation, press period.
This indents the cursor a bit more below the view. Now Xcode neatly formats modifiers at the dot so that they're indented slightly below each view. And now what you're about to see is a handy feature in Xcode called code completion. As I start to type, Xcode will look at what I've typed so far and suggest all of the options it knows about that have the characters that I've just typed.
By the way, you saw more gray predictive code completion show up down below. That's the AI stuff, but the stuff that shows up in pop-up menus is standard code completion. So .f shows all the options that have an F in them.
.fo narrows it down further. .fon narrows it down even further. And we see some other help here. The M to the left of the list of options shows that these options are modifiers or functions that modify the view above it.
And for the item that's highlighted, you'll also see some documentation either above it or below.
You see a description at the very bottom, sets the default font for the text in the view. Also, this arrow with the word text after it
means this font modifier returns modified text.
And if I use the arrow key to move my cursor down to the next item in code completion, I've highlighted font weight. This is a modifier that sets the font weight of the text. You can think of that as being how bold a font is. We'll work with that in just a minute, but let's go back, use the arrow key to highlight that first option, .font, and press return. Xcode then types the .font command since that's what was highlighted when I pressed return, and the stuff highlighted in blue says that the font modifier that we just entered expects an input that indicates the type of font that we should use when modifying the text. Now we're going to ignore the colon and the question marks for now, but how do we know what we can put in here? Again,
notation to the rescue.
Type a dot, and gadzooks, my friends, we see a list of fonts that's the same as the list of fonts that was in the attributes inspector. Also, if you scroll down further in code completion, you'll see more modifiers, some that have parentheses after them. These are more advanced options that let you pass in some values to do things like set custom text fonts. Again, we'll ignore the complex stuff for now, but do feel free to try out some of the other font sizes that you see with dot notation to see how they look in preview. Now, using code completion can also be a great way to avoid typos. Let me show you an example of this. If I go ahead and type large title, .large title with a lowercase t instead of a capital T, I get an error. Type font has no member. Large title with a lowercase t. Xcode is saying, I don't know what this .large title is, all in lowercase. So if I backspace over it again, oh yeah, we need to add a capital T for title. Press return. It's typed in, no typos, and the error goes away.
Fonts in this menu are in large to small order.
If you want any additional information on typography, Apple has a lot of material online.
Here I've searched for the phrase Apple Human Interface Guideline iOS fonts.
The first thing to come up is the typography page of Apple's Human Interface Guidelines. And if I scroll down, you can read choosing fonts to enhance your app, among other bits of useful advice. Feel free to explore this site more on your own. Now let's add another modifier. Over here in the Attributes Inspector, we can select font weight. I mentioned earlier that refers to the thickness of the font's letters. And font weights aren't organized in this menu by thickness, but do try out the different weights. Ultralight is the thinnest, black is the thickest. Let's choose heavy, that's the second thickest. And hopefully you've noticed over here on the left-hand side, we have .font weight added to our code, and the dot value for any of the font weights we're passing in is also been entered automatically by the Attributes Inspector.
Now, most of the time we're going to be coding directly.
So why don't we highlight this line for a font weight that the Attributes Inspector just added for us, delete this, and we'll type it in directly. So when we get to the next line, we'll type in .fon, select font weight, press return. In this highlighted blue area, type dot. If you type HEA, you can see there's only one font weight with those letters in it. That's heavy. Press return again. Nice. Same result. Now let's add a text color.
Now I'm going to show you a reason why you might not want to use the Attribute Inspector. In fact, we're not going to use the Attribute Inspector for nearly all of our lessons in this course. We'll just type in code. So if I select the color pull-down menu over here and select red, I see this code is entered .foreground color with .red passed in as the color parameter. It looks good. It seems to work, but the Attribute Inspector done me wrong. Let me show you how I know this. If I highlight this line of code, .foreground color and backspace, and I retype it with a dot and start to type foreground, I see there are a bunch of options in here, and if I use my arrow keys to highlight foreground color, hey, I see code completion is showing me a yield sign warning. It says foreground color will be deprecated in a future version of iOS, renamed to foreground style. Now, Apple regularly makes improvements to SwiftUI, and this is an example. When it does this, it might eliminate an old technique for a new one. Now, it doesn't get rid of the old way right away. It usually waits a couple of whole version updates for its operating system before it makes the deprecated code unusable. but we want to use the newest technique, so I'm going to highlight foreground style instead. And if you're wondering why Apple made this change, well, the new foreground style doesn't just take colors, it can also take things like gradients that fade from one color to another. We'll learn about those in a future lesson. Now I'll press return. It wants a style in here, but to keep things simple, if I press dot, we'll see Apple still recommends colors. I'm going to select red. I see the same result, but I'm not using deprecated code. Now let's work with our image view. If we click on the line that starts with image, we see our attribute inspector suddenly changes to only show those attributes that are appropriate for an image. We also see the word image in the upper left-hand corner of the attribute inspector. Now if we look at the modifiers below image in our code, we see one called .ImageScale, and inside this is .large, and we can also find image scale in the attributes inspector. And if we click in here, wow, there's a medium and a small, but there's nothing bigger than large, which seems pretty small to me. Now let's modify our code to see what the other values are like. So why don't we delete .large, and instead we'll pass in, let's try small. And ooh, that's most pequeño. We don't want that. I'll undo with a couple of Command Z's. And you might be wondering, hey, how do I make this image larger? Well, the technique that we'll use most frequently is to replace the image scale modifier with two other modifiers. So let's highlight and delete this entire line, image scale, and then on a new line below image, we'll say dot, and start to type in resize, R-E-S-I-Z, and stop there. Now we see there's an option called resizable. Make sure this is highlighted. The arrow we see in here says that this modifier is going to return a modified image, which we'd expect, and the description isn't great. It says sets the mode by which SwiftUI resizes the image to fit the space. Now a better way to describe this would be it resizes the image to take up all available space. Let's press return, and oh, that's one gnarly globe. So in order to take up all available space, SwiftUI allowed the width and height ratio to be distorted. Now you almost always don't want that to happen. So we'll fix this distortion with another modifier below our resizable. On a new line, we'll enter dot and start to type in scaled with an ED at the end. And we see a bunch of different options in here. The one we want is scaled to fit. And again, the description isn't very good. It says scales the view to fit the parent. What it should say is expands the image to take up as much space as it can without distorting or cropping. So let's press return on scale to fit, and this looks much nicer. By the way, another thing to notice about modifiers is that they always start with lowercase letters, so views start with uppercase, modifiers start with lowercase, and also all modifiers have parentheses after them. Some modifiers, like these ones that we use in our text view, accept parameters between the parens. When there aren't any parameters to pass in, we still need empty parens in there. If we don't include those, we'll get an error, but fortunately, code completion types those for us. Now you might wonder, hey, can I change this image? Sure you can. Let's pass in a different string. I'm going to highlight the word globe in here, and I'm going to type in the word cloud, all lowercase letters, C-L-O-U-D. Call Bob Ross, we got a fluffy cloud. How about we change this to iPhone? I'll enter this with all lowercase letters, and ooh, that's quite big. Now what if this were Prince's iPhone? If so, it should be purple. So we can go down here to foreground style, and by the way, it says dot tint in here. It gets that from the system's accent color. By default, this is blue, but if we replace this with dot, and we can select purple in here, dig if you will my cell phone. Now another thing to notice is that the strings that we use for images are very precise. SwiftUI can only use predefined system names, the names of symbols that are built into iOS. So let's change iPhone with all lowercase letters, and we'll write it iPhone with a capital P, which is the way Apple usually spells it. And we see we don't get any image. That's SwiftUI's way of saying you're trying to display a non-exist image. It doesn't give us an error, it just shows nothing. So we'll go back to iPhone with lowercase letters, and I'm going to highlight the whole string iPhone. And you might be wondering, hey, how do I know what system name or symbols are available? Well, we can find those using an Xcode area called the library. To pull up the library, we click on this plus symbol in the upper right-hand corner, and we see a string of icons across the top. We can ignore all of these, but if we hover over the one on the far right, it says show the symbols library. Click that, and if you scroll down here, you can see a whole bunch of symbols. There are thousands. For example, if I click on this pencil.circle.fill here, this is what that symbol looks like. Now you can certainly scroll through these, but you can also use this search field up here. Say you want to find symbols that have a trash can in them. Or if you're in Australia, perhaps some other nations, that might be called a bin, but try trash first. And ho-ho, we see a lot of symbols with a trash can or bin in them. And if I double click this one here that says trash.circle.fill, the library goes away. I see the string that I had highlighted is replaced with trash.circle.fill, and if I delete some of the letters in here, I see the image goes away until I arrive at a valid image name. So there is a valid image for trash.circle, and if I continue to delete, there's a valid image for trash as well. So let's finish up with a small challenge. Let's set the image to the symbol for the Swift programming language using the color orange. So why don't you pause, give this a shot, and when you're done, resume, and let's compare answers. Now we still have the attributes inspector open. We can close that. Then I'll make sure that I select the string trash because we want to replace this. We'll click the plus icon to open the library. We can search on Swift. We get two different Swifts. This first one is the one we want, so I'll double click it and we get our Swift. And here's a bonus tip. If you delete the entire image line here and then open the library and drag over the image that you want and drop it into your code, Xcode writes the entire image line for us. And to get this in orange, we just replace .purple with .orange, cue the Morse Day music, you just did the bird. And if you don't know what that is, you can look it up after you Swift. Our first lesson was full of big learning,
including many topics that are often skipped over in many intro courses. I hope you're enjoying our time together. Keep hacking!